G'day, so in today's video I thought I might give you a couple of essay writing tips for IB Psychology. I made another video about how to write short answer questions, which I hope I can link somewhere here. And so I thought I might do one on essays. What we're going to look at today are 3 rules of threes. I like to keep really basic frameworks when we're looking at IB Psych preparation for the exams. You know, there's a lot to think about, and so I just like to keep the frameworks really basic. So there's 3 rules of 3 I think are pretty good to remember. Before we get into that, just to remind you, I think most essays can look like this, generally speaking. Right, we start with introduction, we get into a central argument, evidence, counter-argument, conclusion. So if you've seen the other video on how to write a short answer response, you know that up until this point, we're pretty much the same. Right, except the difference in essays is we might add another study or a couple of studies, and we add our counter-arguments, which this is where you show your critical thinking. Okay, for example, this is the evaluation of studies or evaluating your argument. Then we get into a conclusion. Now, this is just most essays. There are some exceptions, but I think as a general rule, this is a good one to keep in mind. Alrighty. So, rule number 1. Okay, rule of threes number 1 is I think there are 3 parts to the essay as I just outlined. You've got your central argument that shows your understanding of the topic. This is how you answer the question. You know, and then you've got your evidence. How do you know that? Where did that knowledge come from? And then you've got your counter arguments. Right, this is your critical reflection, your critical thinking. Yeah, I know that, that's the evidence, but, and that's where it comes from. Okay, so first rule of threes, 3 parts to an essay. Let's have a look at an example. Let's say this was a question, one or more effects of genes on human behavior. Shouldn't end with a question mark, but there we go. So my central argument could be how the low expression of the MOA gene affects violence. Right, and I get into that by looking at its role on the brain, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, etc. Okay, so I'm going to show how I understand how the gene affects human behavior. Right, and then I get into my studies. So I might use Meyer-Lindenberg, that study, and also look at Caspi's research. So I've got my studies there to show where that understanding came from. And then I get into my counter-argument. So I might look at, well, hang on, this is genes, but there's also hormones like testosterone can have a factor. And so while we know that genes can affect the brain, so can other factors like testosterone. It could be culture as well. If you come from a culture of honor, I'm here, and this I'm talking about violence, so culture of honor, more likely to be violent. Also, culture of honor can affect testosterone levels, and maybe my childhood experiences, you know, can have an effect. That's shown in Caspi's research, and then I could bring in social learning theory. So there's a lot here for my critical thinking points. So, but that's the first rule of threes. So we have, you've got 3 parts: central argument, studies, counter arguments. Now, I'd like to say that you should aim for equal parts, right? A third, but it's not realistically going to look like that. I think your studies are probably going to be about half of your answer, and this would be about a quarter and another quarter, right, as a general rule. But what you do want to make sure is that, you know, you're not just all studies. That won't score you high marks. And you want to make sure that you're not just all explanation, because you've got, you know, you don't have any studies in your answer, then you're not going to have high marks. And you want to make sure you've definitely got some critical thinking in there, otherwise you're going to get a 0 for that part of the rubric. So remember, and again I'll link somewhere here where I explain the rubric, there are 3 major parts: knowledge and understanding, use of evidence, critical thinking. And that's why your essay should have 3 parts. This is your knowledge and understanding, your central argument, this is your use of evidence, and this is your critical thinking. So you want to follow that first rule of thirds in order to make sure you get high marks in each of those parts of the rubric. Second rule of threes is, I think, aim for 3 studies. Now the general wisdom, and when I was have been telling my students, is aim for 2. 1 study in a short answer response, and maybe 2 for an essay. But I think I'd rather err on the side of safety and go for 3. Right? You can't have too many studies in an answer, because, you know, you can't show too much knowledge, but you just have to find the balance between having to revise and prepare too much and, you know, being able to write about it in the exam. So I think 3 studies. I think you've got your supporting evidence number 1. So you've got your argument, and here's 1 study, and then here's the second study. So aim for 2 studies that support your central argument. You know, one could be an animal study, and the other one could be a study on the brain. Or one could be, I'm thinking about biological stuff here. You know, there could be an example, or maybe your counter-argument has a study involved. So let's have a look, go back to our genes example. My evidence number 1 would be Meyer-Lindenberg, right, and look at how low expression of the gene is connected with the brain. My second piece of evidence would be Caspi, the longitudinal study there, also known as the Dunedin study. And then maybe my counter-argument, I'd include Cohen's research, and I'd go into detailed description about that with the culture of honor and testosterone levels comparing northern and southern participants in the US. And so here, if I was talking about genes and violence, there'd be 3 studies that I could describe in detail and use. So that's the second rule of thirds. First one, 3 parts to the essay. Second rule, 3 studies. Third rule of threes is, I think aim for 3 critical thinking points. Of course, aim for more if you can make them. Don't stop at 3. If you've got 6 to make, go for it. But I do think you want to, 1 or 2 maybe not be enough. So at least 3 critical thinking points. And what I mean by that is really 3 counter arguments, right? 3 ways. And so you might, for example, explain limitations of a study that you've just done. You could come up with the alternative explanations. So, for example, I'll get to the examples in a second. Or maybe ethics could be another one, or areas of uncertainty. So if we're going back to our genes and behavior, I'm talking about the worry gene and violence, and then I've got my studies. Maybe I'm going to say, well, hang on, Meyer Lindenberg, that's measuring the brain in an fMRI. Can we generalize that to real life? And I develop that explanation as to why, that might not apply in a real life situation involving threat and violence. That could be one point I'd make. And another point would be my hormones and culture, right? So that's an alternative explanation. Yeah, genes are a factor, but we can't escape the role of hormones. And even for here, I could even go further. Perhaps it's childhood upbringing, maybe it's serotonin, maybe it's social learning theory. We could have come up with a couple of points here. And maybe I'll go even deeper and say, well, yeah, but we know that the MOAL is associated with low brain function, but we don't actually know why that is yet. We don't know why would low MOA affect brain function. That could be another point I'd make. So I do think you want to aim for 3 different, or at least 3 different critical thinking points. And the reason for that is, if you just say, well, here's genes and here's a study, but look, it could be hormones, and you go into a huge range, description of hormones, I don't think it does a great job of fully showcasing your critical thinking skills. And critical thinking is really hard for a lot of students to do well because it does require really deep, careful, abstract thought. And it is quite hard to get in the top criterion for that part of the essay. So I do think you want to aim for at least 3 separate critical thinking points. Even if they're just, if you've got 3 studies and you try to evaluate all 3 of them and that's the best you can do, that's fine. I think at least aim for 3 points, and if possible, have a range of different points that you're including. So that's the third rule of 3. So just to recap, there are 3 rules of 3. Number 1, there are 3 sections: central argument, evidence, counter argument. Second rule, 3 studies. Aim to have 3 studies in your essay. And finally, I think aim to have 3 critical thinking points. Right, at least 3 critical thinking points, and try and make them different as well. And if you can, so when you're preparing, right, for each of the topics, if you say, right, biological approach, that's going to be my essay question for paper 1, or you might be thinking, right, cognitive approach, that's going to be my essay question for paper 1. Then for each of the topics, be making sure that you prepared these 3 things for each potential essay, and you'll be golden. Alright, so I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions, comments, just leave them in the comments. There'll also be a link to the blog and Facebook groups. Everything there is in the description. So, I hope that helped. Good luck, and cheers.